I mean, when you really think about it, in corporate lawsuits, um, billion-dollar companies usually fall apart because of, like, incredibly complex financial audits.
Right. Or you get those massive server leaks.
Exactly. Or, a whistleblower from the accounting department who just happened to save a decade of emails.
Yeah.
But sometimes an entire corporate empire and arguably the foundational direction of a world-altering technology is put in absolute jeopardy by something incredibly mundane, a
Yeah.
private diary.
It really highlights the vulnerability of the human element, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you can build the most sophisticated legal firewalls, draft the most airtight corporate charters, and yet the private reality captured in ink by one of the architects can just unravel all of it.
It's wild. And welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We have an exclusive and honestly highly specific document on the table today.
We do?
We are going to be dissecting excerpts from a piece of source material titled The Brockman Confessions, Evidence of Breach and Enrichment. And this document, it centers entirely on the high-stakes, headline-dominating lawsuit, Musk v. Altman et al.
Right. And just to establish our parameters right at the top, for you listening,
Yeah.
you are likely following the news, and you know that Sam Altman is currently testifying.
Yeah, that's unfolding literally right now.
Exactly. But our focus today is strictly analytical and laser-pointed elsewhere. We are examining the written diary entries of Greg Brockman as analyzed by our source document.
It's a really unique position to be in as observers, I think, because, we are usually consuming the polished PR statements.
Oh, absolutely. Or the carefully vetted blog posts.
Yeah, the highly produced keynotes that companies use to explain their structural changes. But today, we are looking at the rough drafts of history. We are looking at the messy internal reality behind the polished glass.
Which is rare.
So rare. And the source document we're analyzing argues that these diary entries support two very serious legal charges: breach of a charitable trust and unjust enrichment.
But, before we even get to the specific words written in that diary, we really need to understand the mechanics of the law here.
Let's do it.
Because the source document makes a profound claim. It explains that because these diary statements have been found to be accurate and true by additional testimony and evidence, they legally function as an effective confession of wrongdoing.
Okay, that concept and effective confession, that is exactly where I want to start, because to me that feels like a massive legal leap.
It sounds like a big jump, yeah.
Yeah, because when we hear the word confession, we picture like someone in a gritty interrogation room under a single light bulb.
Or someone signing a formal notarized document acknowledging they broke the law.
Exactly. A diary is entirely different. I mean, you might be listening to this and thinking, I write all sorts of unhinged things in my nap just to get them out of my head.
We all do.
Right. A diary is a sandbox for what-ifs. So how does a private brainstorm get treated by the legal system as the equivalent of a signed confession?
Well, it is a critical distinction, and it really comes down to the mechanism of corroboration and the specific legal hurdle of proving intent.
Intent being the key word there.
Right. In complex corporate litigation, especially cases involving massive shifts in corporate structure or, complex financial maneuvers, plaintiffs face a massive hurdle. They have to prove that the defendants actually knew what they were doing was legally improper.
Because the standard defense is usually some version of the business judgment rule, right? Like, hey, we were trying our best, the market is confusing, and we made a mistake.
Exactly. You can basically call it the oops defense.
The oops defense, I like that.
Corporate leaders can argue that they were operating in good faith. They can say, we navigated a complex transition from a nonprofit to a different model, and hey, if we crossed a legal line, it was an innocent miscalculation.
And courts usually buy that, right?
They do. Courts generally defer to business leaders making tough calls, provided they act in good faith. That defense works incredibly well if you can maintain the shield of ignorance.
So how does the diary pierce that shield?
By establishing the contemporaneous mindset. The source document points out that these aren't just retrospective musings. These entries prove what Brockman knew at the specific time certain actions were being planned and taken.
Right.
But to your earlier point about a diary just being a sandbox, that is exactly the defense the legal team would mount. They'd say, these were just intrusive thoughts, Your Honor, just brainstorming.
Right, because if I write in my diary, I think I'll steal the moon tomorrow. It doesn't mean I'm a supervillain. It just means I had a weird Gru-like thought.
Exactly. But what if, 3 months later, investigators find you building a massive, functioning tractor beam pointed at the lunar surface.
Okay, yeah. The context changes entirely at that point.
Precisely. That is the corroboration the source text is talking about. The document explicitly notes that these statements have been found by additional testimony and evidence to be accurate and true.
Meaning they match reality.
Yes, they align with the actions that were actually taken in the real world. So, the diary stops being a theoretical sandbox. It becomes a documented map of intent.
Because it proves that the tractor beam wasn't built by accident.
Right. You knew exactly what you were doing, and you knew the implications before you did it. It just completely incinerates that innocent mistake defense.
Wow. Okay, that makes the stakes incredibly clear. It's not just that he had thoughts, it's that the thoughts match the subsequent reality, proving the mindset.
Exactly.
So now that we understand exactly why these private entries carry such devastating legal weight, we can look at what the document actually says. And the logic of the source text begins by dismantling the timeline of their public narrative.
Yes, this brings us to the tension between the public commitments they were making and the private structural pivots they were simultaneously planning.
Right.
The source focuses heavily on the concept of deception regarding the nonprofit structure.
And we see this internal conflict boil over in his own words.
Yep.
The source provides a couple of verbatim quotes from the diary.
Let's hear them.
So Brockman is actively wondering about their structure, and he writes, "We've been thinking that maybe we should just flip to a for-profit." And then he writes a sentence that feels incredibly legally fraught. He says, "Cannot say that we are committed to the nonprofit. If 3 months later we're doing B Corp, then it was a lie."
Oh, wow. We really need to analyze that specific word, lie.
Yeah, that's a heavy word.
In legal discovery, finding a document where a key architect explicitly uses the word lie to describe their own contemplated public strategy, I mean, that is the definition of a smoking gun for deceptive intent.
You know, I was trying to map out a way to visualize this timeline issue because the tension really is in that 3 months later window, right?
Absolutely.
Think of it like this. Imagine someone is selling you a premium, non-refundable ticket to an exclusive, deeply committed vegan retreat.
Back with you.
They are taking your money, distributing brochures about animal welfare, and publicly swearing by this vegan mission.
Right.
But in their private calendar, they're looking at a scheduled grand opening for a massive commercial state house on that exact same property set to open in 90 days.
That analogy gets right to the core of the deception argument outlined in the text.
Because they aren't just changing their minds later, right?
Oh, not at all.
It's not that they held a vegan retreat for 5 years, realized it was bankrupting them, and then pivoted. The diary proves they knew, in the exact moment they were making the public promise, that the timeline made the promise a fabrication.
Exactly. The source documents analysis states that this entry is a direct acknowledgement that publicly representing a commitment to the nonprofit while privately planning a conversion to a for-profit or a B Corp would be knowingly false.
The knowing part is key.
Yes, the proximity of the timeline is what makes it a deception. If you know you are flipping to a B Corp in 3 months, you cannot concurrently solicit trust, resources, or public goodwill under the banner of a committed nonprofit.
And you really have to consider the ripple effects of that kind of public posturing. If you are listening to this, think about the last time you read a corporate mission statement from a company claiming to exist purely for the public good.
Right, we see them all the time.
We place a certain societal trust in the nonprofit designation. If the people steering the ship know the destination is completely different from what is printed on the ticket, the public goodwill is just being harvested under false pretenses.
And the source document frames this beautifully in legal terms. It points out that this diary entry proves they understood material representations were false or misleading when made.
Wow.
That is the cornerstone of a fraud or deception claim. It is the conscious awareness of the gap between the public statement and the private reality.
But you know, a lie usually requires a specific audience. You don't just deceive into the void, you deceive someone.
Very true.
The diary proves they knew the pivot was a lie. But who were they worried about lying to? The source points to one very specific, highly involved individual.
Yes. The text moves from the general concept of public deception to the specific ethical and legal obligations owed to their partners. It zeroes in on entries that specifically mention Elon Musk.
And the language here is striking because it strips away all the usual corporate speak.
Oh, come on.
We aren't looking at phrases like strategic realignment or shifting stakeholder priorities. Listen to the words Brockman uses in these diary entries. He writes, and I'm quoting here, his story will correctly be that we weren't honest with him in the end about still wanting to do the for-profit just without him.
That's just so blunt.
It gets heavier. He goes on to say it'd be wrong to steal the nonprofit from him. And he summarizes the entire thought process by writing, that'd be pretty morally bankrupt.
The sheer, unvarnished bluntness of this language is what makes it legally actionable. Let's unpack the word steal.
Yeah, that's the one that jumps entirely off the page for me.
It really does, and it is the anchor for the legal claim of a breach of charitable trust. We need to clearly define what a charitable trust is, mechanically speaking, to understand why the word steal is so devastating here.
Let's do that, because I think people hear trust and they think of like a rich family's bank account, a trust fund.
Right, exactly.
But a charitable trust is fundamentally different, isn't it?
Completely different. Think of a charitable trust like a community well. Okay. You, as the founders, have asked the village to help you dig it, and you've explicitly promised that the water will belong to everyone. Because of that promise, the village grants you certain protections, tax benefits, and goodwill.
Makes sense.
Legally, the entity does not belong to the founders. It exists to serve the public purpose it was chartered for.
So if you decide later that you want to bottle that water and sell it for a profit, you aren't just changing your business model, you are taking something that legally belongs to the public and moving it into your private column.
Precisely. And that is why Brockman's use of the word steal is so legally fatal. He isn't talking about stealing money out of Elon Musk's physical wallet.
Right.
The text analyzes these quotes as a direct acknowledgement that taking this nonprofit enterprise, this community well, and redirecting it away from its original understanding is inherently wrongful.
Wow.
By acknowledging that Musk's story will correctly be that they weren't honest, Brockman is validating the grievance before the lawsuit even exists.
But let me push back on this because I want to make sure we are exploring every single angle here. Isn't stealing just dramatic founder speak?
How do you mean?
Well, we know Silicon Valley is full of hyperbole. People say, we are going to crush the competition, or we stole that engineer from Google. They don't mean literal criminal theft. Couldn't the defense argue that morally bankrupt and steal are just expressions of emotional friction during a really hard pivot, rather than literal admissions of legal theft?
That is exactly the argument a defense attorney would try to make. They would try to soften the language into emotional hyperbole.
Yeah.
But here is why the source document argues the defense collapses.
Okay, I'm listening.
The words aren't isolated. They are attached to a specific structural action, the conversion of the nonprofit. The legal standard for a breach of fiduciary duty or a breach of a charitable trust doesn't require the defendant to feel like a cartoon villain.
Right.
It requires that they knew they were violating the foundational agreement.
They recognize the nature of the act.
Exactly. When you write down, that'd be pretty morally bankrupt, in the context of taking an entity founded with someone else's resources and changing its core structure without their knowledge, you are confessing to an acute awareness of the ethical and legal corruption of the contemplated conduct.
You know it's wrong.
Yes. You are acknowledging the betrayal of the founding principles.
It's the self-awareness that really acts as the trap here. He says Musk's story will correctly be that they weren't honest. He is acting as his own harshest judge in the pages of this diary.
Yes, he is.
He isn't saying Musk might misunderstand our genius pivot. He is saying Musk will say we lied and Musk will be right.
And if we look at the mechanics of the Musk v. Altman lawsuit, the plaintiff has to prove that there was a betrayal of those founding principles.
Right.
The text points out that this diary entry is a direct admission that Musk was deliberately not told the truth about their continuing intent to pursue a for-profit structure without him. It provides the exact narrative the prosecution needs, verified by the defendant's own pen.
Okay, so let's map out where we are so far. We have the timeline of the deception, the explicit admission of the lie.
Correct.
We have the specific target of the dishonesty Musk and the crushing moral guilt of defining the pivot as stealing and morally bankrupt.
Yes.
But if you're listening to this, there is an obvious, massive question hanging in the air.
The question of motive.
Exactly why. If Brockman knew the timeline made the public statements a lie, knew they weren't being honest with a major partner, and deeply personally felt the action was ethically corrupt, why go through with it? Why endure the friction and the moral bankruptcy?
To answer that, the source document points to the final set of diary entries. And these entries shift the conversation entirely.
How so?
Well, we're moving away from the abstract concepts of charitable trusts and moral philosophy, and we are moving directly into quantified financial motivation. We are talking about unjust enrichment.
Let's look at the quotes that define this motive, because they are pretty jarring. Brockman writes, maybe we should just flip to a for-profit. Making money for us sounds great and all. And then there's a second quote that the source document really anchors on. He writes, financially, what will take me to $1?
We need to clearly define unjust enrichment here, relying strictly on how the text frames it, because it is a very specific legal term.
Please do.
Unjust enrichment, in this context, occurs when personal enrichment becomes a motivating objective tied to the control and transformation of an enterprise that was founded as a nonprofit.
Making money for us sounds great and all. It's almost painfully casual when you place it next to morally bankrupt.
It is the stark contrast between public altruism and private wealth hoarding. The source document notes that these entries are a direct acknowledgement that personal financial gain was becoming a primary motivating factor in decisions involving an organization founded for the public benefit.
I have to challenge this logic, though, because we need to pressure test the source document's claims.
Fair enough.
Look, we live in a modern world where tech founders make billions of dollars.
They certainly do.
It is almost expected, right? It's the standard trajectory of the industry. So, is the fundamental problem here simply the scale of the ambition? Is it illegal for a tech founder to want $1 billion? Or is the problem how that billion-dollar ambition was incubated?
That is a crucial distinction, and the source document's core thesis makes it really clear.
Yeah.
The issue is absolutely not the existence of ambition.
Okay.
It is not illegal to want to be a billionaire. The issue is the specific admission of using a nonprofit origin enterprise as the vehicle for that personal enrichment.
Going back to your community well analogy, it's not illegal to build a water bottling plant. It's illegal to build your private water bottling plant by siphoning off the community well that everyone else paid to dig.
That is the exact legal friction.
Yeah.
But let's take your challenge a step further, because the defense would certainly argue about the nuances of their corporate structure.
What would they say?
They might say, well, we eventually adopted a capped profit structure, so it's a hybrid model. A return on investment is permitted within that new framework.
Right. If the rules changed, couldn't Brockman argue that aiming for $1 billers was just operating within the bounds of the new, modified corporate reality?
The source document argues that the diary entries destroy that defense by showing the chronological intent.
The timeline again.
Exactly. The, quote, financially what will take me to $1 up, isn't a reflection on a successful hybrid model years later. It is a motivating question asked during the contemplation of the pivot.
Oh, wow.
The text argues that Brockman's references to making money for us and reaching $1 are admissions that personal enrichment had become the driving force behind the transformation itself.
I see. It's the hijacking of the altruistic vehicle for a joyride to the billionaires club. You can't start a charity, gather incredible resources, talent, and public goodwill under the banner of humanity, and then quietly sit in your office calculating how to leverage that specific tax advantage structure to put $1 billion in your own personal bank account.
Exactly. And that number $1 billion represents a scale of personal enrichment that is entirely fundamentally incompatible with a nonprofit mandate.
Yeah, that's not just paying yourself a nice salary.
No, it's not. The source text makes sure to tie these two elements together. The abandonment of the nonprofit structure is inextricably linked to the pursuit of staggering personal wealth. It proves this wasn't an accidental windfall from a clever business pivot. It was a targeted financial calculation.
It is the difference between finding gold on a hike and specifically using someone else's research grants to fund your private gold mining operation.
That's a great way to put it.
So we have systematically walked through all the pieces of evidence pulled from this diary. We have the timeline proving they knew the public statements were a lie. We have the admission of deception, specifically validating the partner's claims of dishonesty. We have the internal moral compass recognizing the actions as literal stealing and morally bankrupt.
Yes.
And finally, we have the calculated, quantified financial motive of $1 billion.
Which brings us to the synthesis. We have to put all these disparate quotes together to understand the final legal conclusion drawn by the source document. We need to revisit the opening claim we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive.
The claim that these writings are probably enough to doom their case.
Yes, the text boldly states that, and now we can see exactly how it builds that cohesive narrative of legal culpability. It synthesizes the journey into a very clear three-step process of liability, with every single step backed by the contemporaneous diary entries.
Let's walk through those 3 steps, mapping the diary quotes directly to the legal requirements.
Step 1. Misrepresenting commitment to a nonprofit structure. The text notes the explicit acknowledgement that claiming commitment while privately planning a B Corp conversion was a lie.
Okay, so the foundation of fraud is established. They knew the public and private realities were completely disconnected.
Step 2. Participating in the redirection of a charitable enterprise toward private enrichment. The text highlights the admission that personal enrichment had become the motivating objective, cemented by the quotes, "Making money for us sounds great," and "What will take me to $1."
So the motive for the fraud is established right there. It wasn't about saving the company. It was about personal billion-dollar capitalization.
And step 3. Doing so despite recognizing the conduct is wrongful. The text points to the statements that it would be wrong to steal from Musk and that the maneuver would be morally bankrupt.
This is where the compounding effect of the evidence becomes so structurally sound. Think about this logically. If you only had the $1 quote, the defense could easily brush it off. They could say, founders daydream about wealth all the time, it doesn't mean anything.
True. Isolated ambition isn't a crime.
And if you only had the quote about the timeline being a lie, they might argue it was just a clumsy public relations strategy, right? A matter of poor communication rather than actual malice.
They could argue is just a mismanaged transition phase.
Right. But when you lock all 3 together, the knowledge that the timeline is a lie, the financial motive of $1 billion, and the explicit admission that executing the plan is stealing and morally bankrupt, it forms a completely closed loop of intent, action, and knowledge of wrongdoing.
It really does.
It is incredibly rare to see the exact requirements of a complex lawsuit perfectly mapped out by the defendant's own hand.
That rarity is exactly why the source document concludes the way it does. Taken together, it argues, these statements leave almost no ambiguity for a jury to ponder regarding intent.
Wow.
The final sentence of the text is incredibly definitive. It says these statements constitute a legally conclusive, effective confession.
A legally conclusive, effective confession. That's powerful.
It is. They confess that he knowingly misrepresented commitment to the nonprofit structure while participating in the redirection of a charitable enterprise toward private enrichment, despite recognizing the conduct as wrongful. It ties all 3 steps into one unbreakable legal knot.
An unbreakable knot woven from his own private thoughts. It genuinely forces you to reconsider the weight of contemporaneous evidence.
It reinforces a fundamental principle of corporate law. Knowledge and intent are the heaviest weights on the scales of justice. The diary didn't just record history as it was happening. According to the analysis in our source text, it actively sealed their legal fate by removing the only viable defenses they had.
We have covered a massive amount of conceptual ground today. We have taken an incredible journey through the private, unseen pages of Greg Brockman's diary as filtered through the legal analysis of our source document.
We certainly have.
We started by exploring how a private sandbox of thoughts transforms into an effective confession through the power of real-world corroboration. We watched the timeline of public trust fracture in real time as they contemplated the B Corp lie.
Right.
We explored the stark admission of being dishonest with Musk, framing a structural business move as literal stealing and a morally bankrupt choice. And we followed that trail of breadcrumbs all the way to the calculated pursuit of personal, billionaire-level enrichment.
We saw how those private musings, when locked together, construct a comprehensive narrative of a breached charitable trust and unjust enrichment.
We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating intersection of private diaries and high-stakes corporate law. It is always revealing to look past the polished press releases and see the actual gears turning.
It really is.
But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought that expands beyond just this specific lawsuit. We talked extensively today about the concept of a charitable trust the community well.
Yes.
And we saw how easily the foundational direction of a world-altering technology can be secretly, quietly reshaped in the pages of a private diary, completely contradicting its massive public mission. So the question to mull over is this. In an era where the development of world-changing technology requires astronomical amounts of capital, how can the public ever truly trust the stated altruistic goals of the next generation of tech founders?
That's the big question.
When the pursuit of billions of dollars is on the line, does the legal structure of a nonprofit model even stand a chance against the gravity of human ambition? Something to think about. Until next time.